A country cannot lose its navy, a third of its missile arsenal, half its launchers, its most important naval commander, its submarine maintenance capacity, and control of its own western border all inside the same 5 months without something fundamental breaking. That is the claim behind the headline you clicked on, that the United States military has brought Iran to its knees. I want to tell you right up front that the honest answer is more complicated and, in some ways, more interesting than that headline suggests. Iran has been hit harder, faster, and more comprehensively than almost any regional power in modern history has been hit by a sustained American campaign. But knees are not the same thing as collapse, and the difference between those two words is the entire subject of this breakdown. I have flown combat missions in the F-15E Strike Eagle. I spent time flying the F-16 with the Thunderbirds, and before that, I spent years studying weapons employment and targeting at a professional level. That is the lens I bring to every analysis on this channel. And today, I'm walking you through the actual state of Iran's military, its economy, and its internal stability, using named sourcing the entire way through, not vibes and not headlines. Let's get into it. Start with the number that matters most, because everything else in this story sits downstream of it. American intelligence assessments, cited by multiple outlets, working from satellite imagery, signals intelligence, and everything else available to the best resourced intelligence apparatus on the planet, could only confirm with real certainty that roughly a third of Iran's ballistic missile arsenal had been destroyed as this war approached its later months. Another third was assessed as probably damaged, destroyed, or buried under collapsed tunnel entrances, likely gone but not confirmed. The final third was not characterized with any real confidence at all. Sit with that for a second. The most sophisticated intelligence community in the world could only put a firm number on 1 out of every 3 missiles in Iran's entire stockpile, months into one of the most intense, sustained bombing campaigns of the past several decades. Why is something that sounds this simple, just count the missiles, actually this hard? Because Iran does not store its arsenal the way people picture a stockpile, lined up somewhere a satellite can just tally from orbit. A huge share of it sits inside underground tunnels and hardened bunkers, engineered over years specifically to survive exactly this kind of air campaign. When a strike collapses the entrance to one of those complexes, you can confirm the entrance is gone. What you often cannot confirm from the outside, no matter how good the imagery is whether the missiles stored deep inside were destroyed too, or whether they are sitting completely intact under tons of rock and concrete, buried but recoverable once Iran has the time and equipment to dig the access routes back out. That distinction between confirmed, destroyed, and likely damaged, destroyed, or buried is not intelligence agencies hedging for the sake of hedging. It reflects a genuine physical limit on what satellite photography of a collapsed tunnel mouth can actually tell you. And the picture gets murkier still. At one point, a major American newspaper reported, citing officials with access to a classified assessment, that Iran had actually retained roughly 70% of its pre-war missile stockpile. A claim that drew direct public pushback from American officials themselves, including testimony in front of the Senate addressing the discrepancy just days after that report ran. When one part of a country's own intelligence community is publicly disputing a leaked assessment from another part of that same community in sworn congressional testimony, that tells you how genuinely contested this specific question has been at every level, from analysts in the field up to hearing rooms in Washington. Independent analysts working from open source methods have generally landed in the middle of that spread, estimating Iran likely lost somewhere between a third and half of its missile arsenal outright, alongside roughly half of its launchers. That last detail, missiles versus launchers, is the piece most coverage of this war skips entirely, and it is actually the key to understanding why Iran's real fighting capability has degraded further than the missile numbers alone would suggest. Launchers are the physical platforms that actually fire a missile, and they are far harder to hide than the missiles themselves sitting motionless in storage. They have to move to a launch position. They generate heat and electronic signatures that surveillance systems are specifically built to catch, and they are frequently exposed in the open at the single most vulnerable moment in the entire process, the act of actually launching. That makes a launcher a much easier target to confirm destroyed than a missile buried inside a mountain. Multiple sources converge on launcher losses running severe, roughly half destroyed by conservative estimates, with some reporting during the most intense stretches of fighting describing losses exceeding 60% of the pre-war fleet. That distinction matters enormously in practice because even if Iran genuinely retained a large share of its physical missile inventory, a missile without a functioning launcher and without the extraction infrastructure to move it from an underground bunker to an actual firing position is, for practical purposes on any given day, a missile that cannot actually be used. And Iran's own battlefield behavior throughout this war reflects exactly that constraint. Multiple assessments describe a clear shift towards smaller, more irregular missile salvos, rather than the large, overwhelming barrages Iran fired in the opening days of the conflict, a pattern analysts have directly tied to shrinking launcher capacity and degraded logistics, rather than a genuine shortage of missiles sitting in storage. In the first 4 days of fighting alone, Iran fired more than 500 ballistic missiles and roughly 2,000 drones, an extraordinary rate of expenditure by almost any historical standard. That pace did not hold. Launch rates for drones and missiles both collapsed by somewhere between 80 and 90% within about a week, a drop that lines up closely with the launcher destruction numbers from entirely separate sources, reinforcing that whatever is actually constraining Iran's ability to keep fighting at scale, it is showing up consistently across multiple independent measurements of how this war has actually unfolded on the ground. Central Command has stated it struck more than 10,000 Iranian military targets over the course of this campaign, and separately confirmed sinking roughly 92% of Iran's large naval vessels, a specific figure attached to a specific category rather than a sweeping claim about the entire Navy being wiped out. And notably, even with that many targets struck across months of continuous operations, Central Command has specifically declined to put one clean number on total missile or drone destruction. Read that carefully, because it is significant. The organization running the most extensive strike campaign of this entire war, with access to the best intelligence and reconnaissance available to anyone involved, chose not to publicize a single satisfying percentage. If the true number were simple enough to state cleanly, that is exactly the kind of figure a military campaign usually wants to broadcast loudly to demonstrate success. The fact that it has not done that tells you the internal assessment itself remains genuinely uncertain, not simply downplayed for messaging reasons. Now let's turn from the missile force to what has happened to Iran's ability to actually replace what it has lost, because destroying an existing stockpile is only half the equation in a war that has run for months rather than weeks. Early in the campaign, Israeli officials claimed operations had prevented the production of well over 1,000 additional missiles by hitting manufacturing infrastructure directly. American forces have separately published imagery specifically documenting strikes on the factories that build Iran's weapons, stressing publicly and repeatedly that the campaign was never just about existing stockpiles, but about the industrial base that manufactures replacements. If that production campaign has been even partially successful, and multiple independent sources suggest it has, then the real story is not simply how many missiles Iran has left today. It is how much capacity Iran retains to rebuild what it has already lost going forward. A country that enters a war with roughly 2,500 long-range missiles, burns through a meaningful share of that stockpile, and simultaneously loses a significant portion of its production capacity, ends up in a fundamentally worse long-term position than any single stockpile percentage could capture on its own. Move from the missile force to the Navy, and the picture gets even starker. Before we get there, though, it is worth spending real time on the economic side of this war, because a military campaign this sustained never stays contained to the battlefield. And the financial pressure on Iran right now is arguably doing as much damage as any single strike package. The naval blockade alone has been estimated to cost Iran several $100 million a day in lost oil trade, and that number compounds every single week the strait remains effectively closed to Iranian-bound shipping. Iran's currency has faced sustained pressure throughout this conflict, with reporting describing sharp depreciation against the dollar as the war has dragged on, driving up the cost of imported goods for ordinary Iranians at exactly the moment domestic production capacity is also being degraded by strikes on manufacturing and industrial infrastructure. Inflation figures reported inside the country have climbed into ranges that squeeze household budgets hard, particularly for food and fuel. The two categories every government understands can turn economic pain into political instability faster than almost anything else. A government paying hundreds of millions of dollars a day to sustain a blockade it did not choose, while simultaneously watching its own currency lose value and its own citizens absorb rising prices, is managing a fundamentally different kind of pressure than a purely military campaign would create on its own. Wars are rarely lost purely on a battlefield. They are just as often lost, or at least severely constrained, in a finance ministry trying to figure out how to keep paying for a conflict that keeps getting more expensive with no clear end date attached to it. There is a diplomatic isolation angle running alongside all of this that deserves its own mention too. Iran entered this war with a regional proxy network that had already been substantially weakened in the years leading up to it, and the sustained campaign against its missile production, naval assets, and coastal infrastructure has left it with considerably less capacity to project power or support allied groups elsewhere in the region than it had at the outset of this conflict. Negotiations toward some kind of longer-term settlement have continued in parallel with the fighting, with reported target dates for a more comprehensive agreement floated publicly at various points, though the durability of any eventual deal remains genuinely uncertain, given how many separate fronts, the missile question, the naval blockade, the Kurdish situation along the western border, would all need to be addressed simultaneously for a settlement to actually hold, rather than simply pausing hostilities temporarily, the way earlier ceasefire attempts in the same conflict already have. Now turn from the economic picture to the Navy itself, and the picture gets even starker. Iran's fleet of larger vessels has been reduced to a fraction of what it started this war with, according to Central Command's own reporting, and separate assessments describe Iran's fast attack boat fleet, the backbone of its asymmetric strategy in the Strait of Hormuz, retaining roughly half its pre-war numbers despite 6 straight weeks of sustained American and Israeli strikes. Iran's most important naval commander overseeing operations in the Strait was assassinated during this campaign, a loss that goes beyond simply losing an individual. Blockade operations built around coordinating swarms of small, cheap, dispersed assets across a narrow waterway depend heavily on centralized command structure to synchronize timing, targeting, and resource allocation. Removing the officer who built and ran that coordination effort disrupts institutional knowledge and operational rhythm at exactly the moment the underlying strategy was already facing new, effective countermeasures. One of those countermeasures deserves its own explanation because it may be the single most consequential technical development of this entire war. A 60-kilowatt high-energy laser weapon, developed over roughly 8 years and only reaching full operational maturity weeks before this war even began, achieved the first confirmed combat kill by a shipboard-directed energy weapon in naval history, shooting down Iranian drones from a single American destroyer forward deployed in the Gulf. The economics behind that moment are almost unbelievable when you actually lay them out. A cheap Iranian attack drone, costing somewhere in the tens of thousands of dollars, had previously forced American forces to respond with interceptor missiles costing anywhere from $3 to $10 million each. A laser weapon that costs a few cents in electricity per shot inverts that entire equation. It does not fully solve Iran's drone campaign on its own. The system remains limited to a single ship, vulnerable to bad weather and constrained by the ship's own power generation. But it represents exactly the kind of technical answer the cost imbalance underlying Iran's entire strategy in the Strait was built to exploit. And its mere existence changes the calculation behind every future drone launch, even against ships that do not actually carry it. Alongside the laser, 3 unmanned surface vessels navigated into Iran's most important naval base without a single crew member aboard, and destroyed a submarine undergoing maintenance in its gantry, the first autonomous maritime combat strike in American history. A-10. Warthogs and Apache gunships have been redeployed specifically to hunt Iran's fast attack boats at wave-top altitude, a tactic built around exactly the kind of low-altitude persistent lethality that a Cold War tank killer was originally designed for. A naval blockade against Iranian ports has been reimposed and enforced with Hellfire missiles fired directly into a tanker's smokestack, disabling the vessel without sinking it, sending an unambiguous message to every other captain considering a run into Iranian waters. Daily transit through the Strait of Hormuz has collapsed from roughly 110 ships before this war to a fraction of that number since, and that blockade is estimated to be costing Iran hundreds of millions of dollars every single day in lost trade. So far, this all sounds like a country brought to its knees in every meaningful sense. But here is where the honest version of this story gets more complicated, and where I want to slow down rather than just riding the momentum of the headline. Iran is still launching missiles. It struck American positions in Jordan earlier this year with lethal effect, killing American service members, proving that whatever capability remains after months of sustained strikes is still genuinely dangerous. Iran's government has repeatedly stated publicly that its missile and defense capabilities remain intact, a claim that obviously serves a deterrent and morale purpose regardless of its underlying accuracy. But the fact that Iran continues launching attacks at all, even in smaller, more irregular salvos than it fired in the war's opening days, demonstrates ongoing capability rather than total collapse. Degraded is not the same word as destroyed, and conflating the two is exactly the kind of exaggeration that makes a channel's credibility fall apart the moment someone actually checks the sourcing behind a claim like total collapse. There is also the question of what Iran's traditional partners have and have not done throughout this campaign, and the honest answer is less than Tehran likely hoped for when this war began. Iran's broader regional network of allied and aligned groups had already absorbed serious losses in the years leading into this conflict. And nothing in the reporting from these past several months suggests that network has been able to open a meaningful second front capable of drawing American or Israeli resources away from the campaign against Iran itself. Beyond the immediate region, Iran's more distant international partners have offered rhetorical support and, in some cases, economic workarounds designed to soften the impact of sanctions and the blockade, but nothing resembling direct military intervention on Iran's behalf. That isolation matters because it means Iran has been absorbing this entire campaign essentially alone, without the kind of external military backstop that might otherwise have complicated American and Israeli operations or forced a faster negotiated resolution. A regional power fighting largely by itself against a coalition with meaningfully deeper resources is, almost by definition, going to experience compounding pressure over time in a way that a power with active outside military support would not. Now turn from the diplomatic picture to the internal front, because it may end up mattering just as much as anything happening at sea or in the missile fields. While American and Israeli strikes were degrading Iran's missile force and navy, a separate, older conflict along Iran's western border with its Kurdish minority population has been reigniting. Kurdish opposition factions operating out of bases across the border in Iraqi Kurdistan have clashed repeatedly with Iranian security forces in recent months, with monitoring groups documenting at least 9 distinct armed incidents across 3 western provinces since late spring, producing a minimum death toll north of 20 people in just a 2-week stretch alone, described by one human rights organization as the deadliest confrontation between Tehran and Kurdish armed parties in over a decade. Iran has responded by striking Kurdish opposition camps across the border in Iraq hundreds of times, treating a population that makes up roughly a tenth of the country as a preemptive threat to be degraded, regardless of whether those factions had actually launched anything themselves. What makes this internal front strategically significant, beyond the human toll it has already produced, is the timing. Iran is having to divert intelligence resources, security personnel, and political attention to its western border at the precise moment its military has been stretched thinnest by the campaign along its southern coast and in the Strait of Hormuz. A government fighting a two-front problem, one external and conventional, one internal and irregular, cannot allocate resources to either front the way it could if it were only managing one crisis at a time. Kurdish representatives themselves have been careful not to overclaim what their factions can actually accomplish militarily, with officials from several of the larger opposition parties explicitly stating their movements exist independently of whatever settlement eventually emerges from the broader war, while also acknowledging that a visibly weakened central government creates openings their cause might be able to exploit regardless of how the main conflict resolves. The framing that thousands of Kurdish fighters suddenly launched a coordinated offensive against a weakened Iran overstates what is actually happening. This is not one unified uprising. It is several separate, only loosely connected dynamics playing out simultaneously, one faction retaliating against Iranian strikes on its positions, Iranian forces intercepting opposition units attempting to operate inside the country, a newly formed group claiming attacks Iran has not verified, and continued Iranian strikes against exile camps across the border. These groups do not share a single command structure, and at times they have clashed with each other rather than coordinating. But the strategic point underneath all of that fragmentation still holds. Analysts studying the region have pointed out that what has actually changed is not necessarily Kurdish capability itself, but the perception of Iranian weakness, and the fact that Tehran is diverting resources to its western border at the exact moment its military has been stretched thin, dealing with the aftermath of a brutal war and ongoing negotiations with Washington, tells you something real about how thin the regime's margins currently are, regardless of how organized or fragmented the opposition pushing on that margin happens to be. There's one more dimension worth addressing directly before pulling this all together, and it is the hardest one to measure with any precision: domestic Iranian public opinion. Outside observers have limited visibility into how ordinary Iranians are actually processing months of strikes, a weakened currency, rising prices, and a renewed security crackdown along the western border. And any government facing that combination of pressures has an obvious incentive to project confidence publicly, regardless of what internal assessments might actually show privately. What is observable from outside the country is behavior rather than sentiment. Periodic protests reported throughout this stretch of the war, a security apparatus visibly stretched across multiple fronts simultaneously, and a government that has so far shown no public sign of the kind of internal fracture that would typically precede a genuine change in leadership or strategy. That is not a claim. It is a genuine, still unresolved question, and it deserves to be treated as one rather than flattened into a single confident answer either way. It is worth putting this entire campaign in some historical context too, because sustained efforts to grind down an adversary's military and economic capacity through a combination of strikes and blockade are not new to modern warfare, but the scale and duration of this specific effort against Iran stands out even against that broader history. Attempts to hunt mobile missile launchers specifically have historically proven extremely difficult going back decades, to Cold War-era planning exercises and later conflicts, where mobile missile forces demonstrated a stubborn, well-documented ability to survive sustained bombing campaigns, precisely because of their mobility and their capacity to disperse and hide between launches, frustrating even the most sophisticated targeting efforts available at the time. What makes the campaign against Iran notable by comparison is the sheer duration and intensity applied. More than 10,000 targets struck, months of sustained operations, and a deliberate strategy of targeting not just launchers and stockpiles, but the production infrastructure itself, an approach that, if genuinely effective at scale, represents a more comprehensive attempt to permanently degrade a missile force than most historical precedents have achieved. Naval blockades carry their own long history too, and the lesson from most of them is consistent, that economic strangulation works slowly and unevenly, squeezing a government's finances and its population's patience long before it produces the kind of dramatic single moment of collapse that a headline promising a country brought to its knees implicitly suggests. Whether this specific campaign ends up following that slower, grinding historical pattern, or whether the combination of military and economic pressure applied simultaneously across so many fronts at once produces something faster and more decisive than history would normally predict, is a question that will not be fully answerable until well after this war eventually ends, and analysts get real time to assess the full picture with far better information than what is available during active fighting. Put all of these threads together, the missile force degraded by somewhere between a third and half, with launcher capacity hit even harder, a navy reduced to a fraction of its pre-war size, a naval commander assassinated, a laser weapon inverting the cost equation behind Iran's drone strategy, unmanned boats striking a naval base without risking a single American life, a blockade enforced by force and costing hundreds of millions of dollars daily, and a genuine internal security crisis along the western border, consuming resources and attention at the worst possible moment, and you start to see why the knees metaphor captures something real. This is not a country operating anywhere close to where it started this war. Multiple independent pillars of Iranian military and economic power have all been hit simultaneously, not sequentially, which is precisely what makes recovery so much harder than absorbing any single one of these blows in isolation would have been. But knees bending is not the same thing as a country falling over, and Iran has shown throughout this war a stubborn, well-documented willingness to keep absorbing punishment rather than fold. It has continued launching missiles after losing a meaningful share of its arsenal. It has continued closing the strait after losing most of its large naval vessels. It has continued cracking down on its western border after losing a huge share of its coastal defense infrastructure elsewhere. The honest assessment, the one that actually survives contact with the full range of sourcing available rather than collapsing under scrutiny the way an exaggerated headline eventually does, is that Iran has been degraded more severely, more broadly, and more simultaneously than almost any regional power in a generation, while still retaining enough scattered capability across its missile force, its remaining naval assets, and its internal security apparatus to keep fighting, keep threatening the strait, and keep insisting to its own population and the wider world that it has not actually been broken. Whether that continues to hold as the campaign grinds on, as production facilities remain under pressure, as the internal Kurdish situation either escalates or gets managed, and as the economic cost of the blockade keeps compounding day after day, is the actual open question sitting underneath a headline that wants you to believe the story is already finished. It is not finished. It is somewhere in the middle of one of the most comprehensive, multi-front campaigns any regional military has faced in recent memory. And the next few months are going to tell us far more about where this actually ends than anything that has happened so far. A few specific indicators are worth watching if you want a clearer read on where this actually heads next, rather than just waiting for the next dramatic headline to tell you how to feel about it. First, whether Iran's missile production facilities show measurable signs of recovering despite continued strikes against them, because that single data point would tell you more about Iran's long-term trajectory than any snapshot count of its current stockpile ever could. Second, whether the naval blockade actually holds long enough and stays costly enough to force a genuine shift in how Tehran approaches the strait, or whether Iran simply absorbs the daily financial cost the same way it has absorbed military losses elsewhere in this war. Third, whether the situation along the western border with Kurdish opposition factions escalates into something more coordinated, or whether Iraqi and regional pressure manages to contain it as a persistent but manageable irritant rather than a genuine second front. And fourth, whether ongoing diplomatic talks towards some kind of broader settlement actually produce something durable this time, or collapse the way earlier ceasefire attempts in this same conflict already have. Every one of those four threads is still genuinely unresolved, and any single one of them breaking sharply in one direction or the other could meaningfully change how this entire war gets remembered a year from now. A final point worth making before wrapping this up is about how quickly a story like this can shift underneath you. A number reported as confirmed on one week can look incomplete or outright wrong within a month, once more imagery becomes available, once a tunnel complex actually gets inspected on the ground, rather than assessed from orbit, or once a new intelligence assessment supersedes an older one entirely. That is not a flaw in how this war is being covered. It is simply the nature of trying to measure military and economic damage in real time, during active fighting, using imperfect tools that were never designed to produce a single clean number on demand. Anyone promising you total certainty about exactly how degraded Iran's capabilities are right now, in either direction, is selling you something simpler and more satisfying than what the actual sourcing supports. Two things before you go. If this breakdown gave you the fuller sourced picture instead of just the headline version, share it with someone who is trying to actually understand what has happened to Iran's military over these past several months, rather than just accepting a dramatic title at face value. And tell me in the comments which piece of this you want tracked next. Whether Iran's missile production shows real signs of recovering despite the ongoing strikes on its factories, whether the Kurdish situation along the western border escalates into something bigger, or whether the naval blockade holds long enough to actually force a change in Iran's calculation about the strait. I read every comment, and on a story with this many moving pieces, that feedback genuinely shapes what gets covered here next, sometimes more than any single new headline does. Stay skeptical of any single number or headline in this war that sounds too clean or too convenient to be entirely true, because the real picture, almost every single time you actually take the time to dig into the sourcing behind it rather than just accepting the first version you see, sits somewhere messier, somewhere more contested, and somewhere more genuinely uncertain than the version built purely to grab your attention for the next 30 seconds before you scroll past it to something else entirely. Stay locked in, because whatever comes next in this campaign, whether it breaks toward a lasting settlement or toward another round of escalation, is going to matter just as much as everything we just walked through together. And I will be back with the next update the moment there is something real to report rather than more speculation dressed up as certainty.